So, are your strategies moving you towards your vision at the pace you want? For a lot of people, that's a maybe and a lot of no's. In this episode, we're going to cover what's hampering that strategy from making your vision come true. Let's go. At the root of what most everybody's dealing with right now is the pace of innovation and the pace of demand in the marketplace. And so executives within the Fortune 500, global S&P 500 really are driving towards innovation decisions without considering execution capability. It's a lot about what should we be doing versus can we actually execute on that. And so this is why we've had things like Moneyball come in. That's where the analysis of the true execution capability began to affect how baseball teams recruited.
You don't put a team together with a computer, Billy.
No?
No. Baseball isn't just numbers. It's not science. If it was, then anybody could do what we're doing, but they can't because they don't know what we know. They don't have our experience and they don't have our intuition.
Okay.
Now, there are intangibles that only baseball people understand. You're discounting what scouts have done for 150 years, even yourself?
Adapt or die.
Baseball thinking is medieval. They are asking all the wrong questions. People who run ball clubs, they think in terms of buying players. Your goal shouldn't be to buy players. Your goal should be to buy wins.
To demonstrate that, I've got a model here that I developed. So let's start with the x-axis. That's our time. On the y-axis, we have the iteration. What phase are you in the business? And as you see in the current box, your current operating model, your people, process, and technology are optimized for today's environment. You're running at the highest efficiencies, you reduce costs as much as you can. As we introduce that next iteration of the business, that forward movement to the strategy, what we're going to see is that there's an overlap between the future state and the current state. That overlap is really all that remains between the current state and the future state. And what we have now responsibility for is that we need all new people, process, and technology to be able to realize the future piece. And where we see the gap is between the edge of the current and the edge of the future, and that's our execution capability gap. And that's our root cause issue, why strategies are not able to meet the vision at the pace we need to meet expectations. So what happens in the cycle? There's a lot of innovation that's been pushed over the last few years. That innovation is the driver for growth, and that has its place, but it has to be balanced with execution capability. And what we found through the research, through the studies that have happened from multiple universities over 20 years, really is that 50% of the decisions in the executive decision-making process are failing. They're not working. And so if we start to really take a look at that impact, we begin to understand the economics as to why we're struggling to meet our top-line revenue growth or those market expectation growth issues. And what it really happens is that it starts when we have that market shift, we have that strategic shift, operations kicks in, they begin to generate ideas in terms of meeting strategy. It then goes through the cycles of approval. It goes through that analysis phase, and then it goes through the approval phase. And most executives are really frustrated with the amount of time that this takes. But especially what happens is we get into the decision phase and we don't know what's going to work and what's not. And so we're using a lot of bias. We're introducing bias here as to making decisions and moving forward. And what that's really coming out and having the data to show us that what's bearing is the fact that 40 to 50% of those decisions are not producing any value to the business. So think about what would happen if you could remove 50% of those bad decisions and start to fund only the ones that you knew were going to generate the value you needed. And suddenly your EPS gets impacted. Professor Paul Nutt from Ohio State did a 20-year study and came up with some very dramatic data as to what was really happening within that decision-making process. And that decision-making process is what needs to be trued up. It's the thing that is holding back the ability for S&P 500, Fortune 500 companies to meeting their targets. Right now, the decision-making processes are very biased on analytical data around what is the value of the opportunity against the economics of the opportunity. And what we're forgetting to include in here is that metric. And so we need to start to think about these things more like how a loan is made. Because at the end of the day, when executives provide money into operations, it's a loan. It's a loan with a ROI expectation coming back. And if that loan isn't having some metric and execution capability, it's like lending for a building or a car or any other asset without a credit score. And so creating that balance allows us to generate a better pool of initiatives to consider in the decision-making process that can be executed within the timeline that is being put upon us by either analyst expectations or market expectations. And so if we look at the diagram here, what we're seeing is a metric across the x-axis with all the possible initiatives that we're considering and doing in the strategic level on the y-axis. And when we have these overlapping curves, we're looking at the bad initiatives, bad projects that we could do against the good projects we can do. And what we want to do is we want to find that nexus point within our own business and our own decision-making process in terms of how much risk are we willing to take, but begins to edge out the bad initiatives so that we have more capacity moving forward to invest purely on the initiatives that are going to generate the value we expect. Or understanding that as we do this and we invest in initiatives that are going to be more difficult, it's not going to allow us to do other things, but we're going to have to focus our energy and resources onto those things. And so at the end of the day, it's about creating better balance in the decision-making process, really removing the bias out of that process, allowing innovation to stay, but balancing it against execution capability so that we don't wind up in a space of damage control where a high percentage of our initiatives, our strategies aren't working. It's frustrating the market. It's frustrating our own staff. It hurts retention. It hurts company brand and image. So I hope these are considerations that help. Would love questions. Please subscribe. I think it's over here. And would love your feedback. Thank you.